Hi, everyone. Welcome to this podcast with my special guest, Arthur Kronberg. He's an adjunct professor teaching at NYU Business School, and he is also the author of What You Should Know About Chinese Economics, and highly recommend that book. And today it's a great honor to have you here in my podcast, Arthur.
Yeah, very glad to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah. So first question I have is for you is I'm really interested in like how did you get into this field of study like Chinese economics? Like what made you like be interested in this topic?
It was basic, yeah. I basically got into it by a complete accident. Uh, at university, I had nothing, I studied nothing related to economics.
Hmm.
My major was actually comparative religion. I was interested in ancient Buddhism and things like that. And spent a lot of my coursework looking at Asia, so India and China both, but from a not from a modern history or politics or economic standpoint. Um, and then I went into journalism after that, and was a freelance uh, writer for newspapers and technical publications for a number of years. Um, and I wound up traveling a lot in Asia because my wife at the time was a U.S. diplomat.
Hmm.
Was assigned first to India and later several times to China. And when we were living in India in the late 80s, I started to perceive that a lot of the political discussions there had kind of economic underpinnings that people weren't paying that much attention to. So I started to get interested in economics. And when we moved to China in the early 90s, it was right about the time that Deng Xiaoping had launched his Nanxun, which restarted reform after the Tiananmen lapse.
Hmm.
Um, and so it was a very interesting time to be in China to witness the transformations that were going on in the economy and the business environment. And I kind of got hooked. So after doing that for a number of years on a freelance basis, I set up a company in Beijing in 2002 to, do a more formal, um, be able to study the Chinese economy more formally. And that's where I've been for the last almost a quarter century.
Awesome. Like what kind of lead you to write that book? I really like your book, and to be honest, like the first time I saw your book, I read it. This is the first book I read about Chinese economics without too much emphasis on ideology. Like a lot of books
Right,
around, like either in English or Chinese, you're either pro the
right.
CCP regime or you're against it. Like there's no balanced view. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. So what led me to write it was, well, I was invited by the publisher Oxford
mhm.
to write the volume. They were interested in doing something in the Chinese economy, and a number of my professional economic academic friends recommended me. Um, and basically, what I and the editor felt was that there was a gap in the market. There was a need for a book that would simply describe how China had gotten to where it was.
Mhm.
And this was around 2015, so it had risen quite a lot, but it's not obviously a lot has happened since then. Um, yeah, so there was a need for a book that would describe China, how it got to where it was in a way that was sort of normal people could understand. So it was
Mhm.
not intended to be a book for specialists. So less technical, but also uh, just very straight and, as you say, non-ideological. And I think that's what the publisher wanted, and that's what I wanted to write because I agree with you. A lot of the discussion about China's economy and what's going on there, it basically winds up being a debate about its political system, and people
Exactly.
smuggle political arguments into discussion of economics. And it's perfectly reasonable to debate China's political system. That's a worthy topic of conversation. Um, but uh, I think a lot of the economic discussions, particularly in the more popular media, get polluted by political assumptions that people don't really question. So my standpoint throughout my career has always been to downplay the ideology. Um, and try and just be data driven and look at the facts. And one of my mantras is that economics is not a morality play.
Exactly. I totally agree.
What happens in economics is, has a lot of implications for societies and how they're structured and so forth. And, those need to be taken into account, but economic forces themselves are distinct from a sort of moral discussion. And it's possible to evaluate an economy on its own merits without getting into a bunch of value judgments. So that's what I generally try to do.
Yeah. So by that time, when you start to write that book, how many years you've been living in China, or like maybe visiting China and doing observations?
Yeah. Well, I first moved to China in 1991, and I lived there mostly full time until 2016. So I'd been there, about a quarter of a century.
Yeah.
There were some gaps in there, but it was most of it. And then I was half and half in China and the US until about 2020. And then since then, I've mainly been living in New York.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to dive in the first question. You see the screen here. This professor, his name is Qinhui. So he's from a top university in China. Like he teach history there. So economics now his major focus. But recently he did a podcast and he basically argued that the Chinese economics growth in the past 30 years, I would say after the Deng Xiaoping changed the policy, is primarily due to the low human rights advantage. That's his core argument. He thinks that China's system is artificially lower the factor cost by suppressing the rights, especially you ban those independent unions. You can now easily form a labor union to negotiate your wages. And also the government can seize the land without any fair compensation, which happened a lot 20 years ago, I would say. So this is similar to how the slave-holding South outcompete the North in America pre the Civil War America. Do you agree or disagree with that kind of argument?
Well, I agree with part of it, right? And I think Qinhui is a very insightful scholar, and I think has very, very good observations on how China works. And what I would agree with is there's no question that the Chinese economic model depends on a lot of efforts by the state to repress certain costs, right? And so I think the point about labor unions and just sort of labor policy generally is absolutely correct. So essentially, starting in the 80s, they set up a system where labor was free to move into the cities, which it had not been able to do during the Mao era, when the cities and the countryside were strictly segregated. So if you wanted to work in a city, you could move there, but you didn't gain any civil rights in that city. You didn't gain access to the local pension system or the welfare system or anything. And so it created a certain kind of instability or insecurity. And it tended to lower the cost because the localities that were doing the hiring didn't really have to bear the full social burden in terms of social welfare and so forth of hiring all these people. And the prohibition on independent labor union organization and other things, indeed, I think has, tilted the balance in China over the last few decades in favor of capital at the expense of labor to some degree. So I think that's true. You can look at other things. A commonly cited thing is, environmental compliance costs in China for many years were way lower than elsewhere. They were willing to sustain higher levels of pollution. That's normal, in pretty much every developing economy. Yeah. So that's not unique to China. But then the other thing is financial repression. And so the government basically controls the financial system, determines where things can be invested, and is able to keep the cost of financing pretty low. And so again, that is a benefit for capital. So I would agree with those elements of the argument. Where I would disagree is that you could compare this in any way to the southern United States pre-Civil War or anything like that, because the other part of what was going on was an intensely competitive industrial system. And it was competitive in two ways. One, there's a very fiercely competitive domestic market where, yeah, you can get your cheap inputs and so forth, but then you have to compete against all the other companies that are also getting those cheap inputs. And the state, generally speaking, is not going to guarantee success to any one actor. So in order to survive in that environment, you have to have something other than cheap input costs because everyone else has the same input costs.
Correct.
And then second, they focused on export-oriented manufacturing. And the point there is that every successful development story, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Germany after World War II, has depended on export-oriented manufacturing as a way of stimulating, technological upgrading. And you could say, well, okay, these things gave China an unfair advantage in global markets, and that's, I think, partly true. But it's also definitely true that because of the need to export and the need to compete in the domestic economy, the companies got very innovative. And I think a lot of China's growth is coming from that innovation and that technological upgrading, not just from cheap inputs.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think especially nowadays, like China is no longer the cheapest labor market. Like you get much cheaper labor from other like South Asian countries, but still China still dominates in certain manufacturing areas.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Because what China has been able to do is, they have the cheap inputs, but they also have first-class infrastructure, and they have for many years.
Yeah.
And very few countries have both lower labor costs and first-quality infrastructure. And now I think what you're seeing today is that the benefits of creating this very large manufacturing ecosystem where you can scale up products very quickly are coming to fruition. Yeah. So cheap inputs definitely part of the story, but only a part.
Only a part. I don't know if you kind of see the similarity. I think like both China and the U.S. have this kind of similar dual citizenship status. Like, in U.S. you have a lot of they call it illegal immigrants, or like like immigrants without any legal status. For that type of person, they contribute to a lot of like lower cost service and goods provided in the U.S. market, but the U.S. government don't have to cover their any social welfare.
Yeah.
In China, you have that similarity, right?
Right. Well, this is, I think, a great example of where it's easy to fall into false equivalence. So, yes, both of those things exist, but the scale is completely different. So if you look at the United States, I think the total foreign-born population in the United States is, I think, about 25% of the total population. And, the vast majority of those people are documented and have full legal rights. And so I don't know exactly what the undocumented immigrant population is, but I would venture to guess it's probably on the order of 3 or 4% at most of the total workforce. In China, it is still the case that 1/3 of the population of urban China, and the population of urban China is about 800 million people. 1/3 of those people do not have full hukou or residence rights. So the number of people in China who are in this kind of second-class labor situation is a population greater than the entire population of the United States.
Yeah.
And on a workforce basis, it's probably equal to or greater than the entire labor force of the United States. And as a share of China's workforce, it is very, very large.
Yeah.
So yes, this phenomenon does exist to some degree in the United States, but it's tiny. Whereas in China, it's absolutely central. And I think that's where Qinhui has a good point, that this was not just some incidental part of the development process. It was pretty central for a very long time.
Yeah. Okay, then the second question becomes very interesting. Like a lot of people kind of argue like the current Chinese debt problem, like the economic downturn. A lot of people analyze it to similar to Japan, what happened like after their real estate bubble burst. But also another scholar, he's also a very reputable one in U.S., Professor Xu. He argued that like China's current situation is like the Soviet Union in the 70s. The argument he had is like, China doesn't have those like independent labor union or any collective bargaining rights. And also you have this government that's like cannot really pivot to the consumption model and really hitting, they call it, I don't like institutional ceilings, like in the system.
Yeah.
It's a hard institutional ceiling instead of just like hitting a market cycle. And that's why he argued that the political system, if not really fully reformed, is going to exhaust all the economic potential and really kind of suppress efficiency now. Like, do you think his argument, I know it's a little bit tilted towards the ideological part, but like, do you think his argument is correct or his analogy is like reasonable?
Yeah, well, if you don't mind me taking a little while, I want to address both these two comparisons separately, the balance sheet recession one and the institutional ceiling one, because they're both pretty widespread, and it's understandable why people support them. I don't really disagree. I don't really agree with either one of them. So, so fundamentally, I think that China is a much more dynamic and resilient system than either Japan of the 90s or the Soviet Union in its late era. And so its prospects are much stronger. So let me explain why. So Japan, this was a comparison that was common among Western economists 2 or 3 years ago when China had a very anemic recovery from the COVID pandemic, and the debt problems of the local governments and the state enterprises became very prominent. And so the idea was, look, Japan in 1990, they had a lot of debt, they had a big real estate collapse, the economy stagnated for about 15 years. It took a lost decade of very low growth and deflation. And China, according to some people, was basically headed for the same thing. And I thought this was wrong for several reasons. The central one is that if you look at the financial structure of Japan circa 1990, it had what I would call a unified national balance sheet, which is to say that financial companies, banks owned equity in industrial companies. Industrial companies owned equity in the banks. So there were these cross shareholdings. And when times were good, this was very beneficial because the industrial companies could get cheap finance and so forth. But at the bottom of all of this unified balance sheet was land values that had just exploded. So land values in Japan increased by about 600% during the 1980s. And by 1990, it was common to value Japanese companies not by their profits or what they did, but how much land they own and how much that land was worth. Right? And so the problem was that those land values had just been propped up by a financial bubble. And when they collapsed, and ultimately they fell by about 80%, what that meant is that the equity value, not only of industrial companies, but also the entire financial sector also shrank. Because everything was built on this basis of land values. And when the industrial companies collapsed, the financial companies also collapsed because much of their value was in the shares that they owned in these industrial companies. So everyone was tied together and they all sank together. China has never allowed that. They've never allowed cross shareholdings between industry and banks, precisely for this reason. They saw that problem. They saw similar problems in Korea. They said, never let that happen here. So yeah, you wound up with a real estate bust in China since 2020, and that's bad for the real estate developers. It's bad for the local governments. It basically has very little impact on the financial system, particularly the big systemic banks who did not have large real estate exposures, and it had zero impact on the tech companies, the Huawei's and the BYDs of the world. They were totally unaffected, and so they could invest massively. And so if you look at what happened in Japan in the 1990s was that there was a collapse in investment across the board. In China, what you saw after 2020 was a collapse in investment in real estate and a gigantic boom in investment in manufacturing. So it's a completely different dynamic and has led to a much more positive result. So that's, I think, the central difference between China and Japan. The Soviet institutional ceiling argument is sort of a repackaging of an argument that has been around for basically as long as I have been going to China. And I first went to China in 1985 as a tourist. And since the beginning of reforms in the 1980s, people have said, look, you've got this dynamic, somewhat capitalist economy with a big private sector, and you have this Leninist authoritarian centralized government on top. These two things are fundamentally incompatible, and one of them is going to break. Yeah. And so for a long time, people said, well, what's going to happen is the economic system will break the political system, and they'll have to do political reform. And, the counter argument has always been, no, the political system will strangle the economy and they'll stop growing, right? Mm-hmm. And every iteration of this argument for the last 40 years has been wrong.
Yeah, I know.
The economy continues to grow. It's now the second biggest in the world. It's slowed down, a bit, but it's still one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It is the world's biggest manufacturer, biggest trading nation, very dynamically integrated with the rest of the world. And the Communist Party is still very much in control and doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So just because an argument has been wrong for 45 years doesn't mean that it couldn't be right in the future, but you do have to ask yourself, okay, what's going on here? And I think what this ignores is, again, if you look at the structure of Chinese institutions, political, economic institutions, for a very long time, they have been very, very different than they were in the Soviet Union. Even going back to the Plan period, if you compare Maoist China to the Soviet Union during Khrushchev or Brezhnev's time, China was way less centralized. The central government controlled far less prices. You had this very distributed idea where each locality had to produce all its own stuff because Mao was paranoid that China would be invaded. So he wanted there to be duplicate industrial infrastructure everywhere. So it was formally centralized, but it was in fact much more decentralized, and the central government had much less sway over what was going on at the local level, even during Mao's time. And what that meant was that when you liberalized in the 1980s, there were a lot of local actors, both government and private sector, that were completely unconstrained in what they could do. And they just said, oh, it's now okay to make money. Let's go out and make money. And so they did. So that was a very different baseline condition, right? And then second, if you look at the way that China has tried to develop its economy, they've been very, very clear that they wanted to avoid the pitfalls of the Soviet Union, which they've studied carefully. So again, they focused on export manufacturing. So they opened to the outside world. They did not pursue autarky, which is what the Soviet Union did. And they focused very, very diligently on how do we create different mechanisms for technology transfer to upgrade our abilities. And they've, had, as I said, a much more competitive economy for a very long time. So the Chinese economy bears no resemblance whatsoever to any iteration of the Soviet or Russian economy at any point in time. Now, I think what Professor Xu is pointing out, and I think he's absolutely correct in this, is that, okay, maybe this was true for a while, but clearly under Xi Jinping, you've had a very strong move to centralize power, to increase the power of the state, reduce the power of private entrepreneurs and the private sector, put capital allocation much more back in the hands of the state than in these non-bank financial institutions and so forth. So is the system more centralized, more authoritarian, more state-directed and controlled today than it was 10 years ago? Absolutely. And does that increased centralization, state control, create a risk that you slowly start to suffocate the engines of innovation in China and creativity? Absolutely. Those risks are there. And I think it's totally appropriate to point those out. And I think if you just look at China's growth performance over the last decade, it's very clear that as this centralization, grew, China started growing slower. And part of that was natural, but I think the last several years, it's very clear that China is growing slower than it potentially could. Its potential growth rate is a point or two higher than what we're actually seeing. And the government and Xi Jinping seem to think, that's okay, because the technology a bit is doing well. So I think it's right to point out that there's increased risk of this kind of institutional ceiling. But I have to say that if you look over many decades, what you find is that time and again, China has seemed to run up against institutional limits of one kind or another. Mm-hmm. And then the system has adjusted in order to keep growth and technological progress going.
Yeah.
And what you see in the manufacturing sector in China today is basically that. Yeah, if you're an internet entrepreneur, your life is bad now compared to what it was 7 or 8 years ago. But if you're in technology-oriented manufacturing, mm-hmm. your problem is not that the government is squeezing you out. Your problem is that you have this just incredible competitive pressure from everyone else in your sector. So it's a problem of sort of capitalism on steroids, if you will, as opposed to an overly oppressive government.
Yeah, I think like the rhetoric changed a lot, I think, in recent years. I believe like 2 or 3 years ago, there's a lot of like, internet KOLs, they came on to podcasts and published articles saying, oh, now it's a state time, like it's in Chinese, it's called 国进民退, which it means like the state company is going to own everything. Like private company, they can just like exit the stage. It's our show now. But I think like right now, nowadays, they pull back that rhetoric a lot because a lot of like, small business owners, they're scared. They just like flee the countries, right?
Yeah. No, and it's absolutely true that if you talk to people in the business class in Shanghai or Beijing, and particularly people who did well in the 2000s and the 2010s, they are very, very disgruntled with the mm-hmm. current state of affairs. They're very unhappy that the government is not allowing more freedom and the government is not more pro-growth in a general sense. And there's absolutely no question. If you just read the economic data from month to month, mm-hmm. China has a very significant confidence problem. Consumers, households, they don't want to buy stuff.
Yeah.
They're holding back and saving all their money, not spending it. And private companies are very, very reluctant to invest. Mm-hmm. Particularly if what they're producing is sort of consumer-facing products and consumer-facing services, because they just see consumers like downgrading their consumption all the time. So there's no question that you've got a significant lack of confidence relative to what you had several years ago. I just think that as bad a problem as that is, China is a big country, and there are big chunks of the economy that are globally significant, mm-hmm. essentially in the tech industrial sector, which are doing extremely well. And where the problem for entrepreneurs is not a lack of confidence, right? The problem is just an extraordinary amount of competition.
Competition, yeah.
They have to work very hard. But it's that, you look at the people who are leading companies like BYD or Xiaomi or CATL or any of these companies, mm-hmm. They exude confidence that they have literally world-conquering products, and they're probably mm-hmm. right. But their life day to day is kind of not so great because all their competitors are making it very, very hard for them to, keep the level of profitability.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, now let's move on to the next question. I think that this question is going to be interesting because I think everybody, like all the economists was like kind of recommending China mm-hmm. is like increase your consumption. Even the US government, I think, kind of pressure China to kind of transform the economy from export oriented towards consumption oriented. I think Professor Xu argued that, because of the current Chinese distribution policy, like how you kind of distribute the wealth among all the citizens in the country, it's very difficult to actually convince all the Chinese that, yeah, we're going to encourage a consumption led model because of that. Like they just don't have the money, or they don't have the confidence in the economy that when they spend that money, the state is going to hold them back if like the bottom falls out, right? Like if you have another COVID hit, or like there's a bubble burst and you lost your house, you lost your job, like what you do,
Right.
there's not much welfare to kind of hold them up. That's a reason like a lot of consumers in China are very reluctant to spend, and they actually pivot towards like, they call it transition to a lower priced goods, like
Right. Yes.
downgrade of the consumption.
Consumer downgrade. That's right.
Yeah, consumption downgrade. So what do you think about the current situation and also all the conflict among that distribution system? Like if the state or the Beijing refuse to empower all the worker like politically, like give them the union rights, increase their earnings, or like boost their property rights, like give them like permanent property ownership. Calling for this boosting domestic consumption is simply rhetoric instead of really anything that holds water. What do you think?
Yeah, this is a very messy discussion, I have to say. So the first observation is, okay, so people have been commenting on the so-called lack of consumption in the Chinese economy, for decades.
For decades, yeah.
Right. And what they point to is if you divide the economy into, investment and consumption, those are the two main components of it. You'll see the Chinese investment, the share of China's economy that's investment is very high. The share of China's economy that is consumption is very low by international standards. So there's some technical problems the way the Chinese statistics are constructed. I think they underestimate the true consumption rate. It's probably 5 or 6 points higher than is reported in the data. Even if you make that adjustment, it's still on the low side. But it's also the case is what economy had by far the fastest rate of household consumption growth from 2000 to 2020. It was China, and it was not even close, right? So I think Chinese household consumption grew sixfold during those 2 decades from 2000 to 2020. You look at another high growth, emerging economy, India. It was, I think, the growth was, a quarter of that. You look at any, advanced economy, it was way lower. So it is false to say that China has had weak consumption growth. They've had actually extremely strong consumption growth. And, anyone who is aware of what the standard of living was in China, urban China 20 years ago, and what it is today, and there's just no comparison.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first thing that we need to stipulate is that when people say China's consumption is weak, that isn't actually true in absolute terms, right? It's true in terms of some picture that you draw of the structure of the whole economy and the share of consumption. And, I think what's more accurate to say is that it's not that China consumes too little, it's that it invests too much, right? Yeah. So this is the fundamental issue that the way the state is constructed, the state essentially controls the financial system. So all the excess money in the economy essentially flows into state-controlled institutions, and it is allocated to investment needs first. And the investments are strategic. So in other words, they're not saying what is the investment that's going to get us the highest financial return in the next 2 years, which is basically how it works in a country like the United States. They say, what are the strategic industries that the state wants to support over the next 20 years? Let's put a bunch of capital into them and, hope it eventually works, right? So what you wind up doing there is taking a lot of money out of the households and using it to finance very long-term investments in infrastructure, industry, and so forth that may, in fact, produce a good economic return over a long period of time, but actually don't provide a very good financial return in the short run. And what that does is, if you think about a U.S. household, American household, or a European household, they have some extra money. What do? They might invest it in the stock market. They might invest it in, bonds that generate certain kind of return. And so they wind up in aggregate having quite a bit of financial income in addition to their wage income. Mm-hmm. In China, basically, households are not allowed to have any financial income because all financial income is essentially seized by the state and put into these long-term investments. And I think that is actually a bigger cause of this low consumption rate. Mm-hmm. It's that basically people don't have as much income in China as you would expect given the rate of development. And part of that has to do with wage suppression, but part of it also has to do with the sort of commandeering financial income by the state rather than the private sector. And I think that's more important than often when people talk about the social safety net, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Now, is that ever going to change? I would say, no, this is not going to change. So where I would agree with this critique is, well, I think that the underconsumption problem is in a sense overstated. I think the balance between investment and consumption in China is basically fixed in stone because that's what the government wants it to be. And because they control the entire financial system, they can make it to be that way. And as long as enough of these investments produce some kind of an economic return over the long run, the system can continue. So I'm making a lot of sort of technical disagreements with the argument, but the conclusion I actually agree with, which is that there is almost no possibility that within the next few years, we will see a significant shift in China's economic model away from this sort of investment and export-led growth to a more consumption-driven model. I just don't see that happening because, basically the Communist Party has decided how things should run. And from their point of view, it's been very successful. They've created a gigantic economy where everyone, has a much better life than they used to. And Chinese companies are now increasingly, globally competitive across a wide range of technologies. So they say, what is the problem here? People have a good life. We have addressed our needs for global competitiveness, for national security, et cetera. It's fine, right? And so an economist will say, well, but you've left a lot of consumer welfare on the table. But the party will just say, well, we beg to differ. Now, we have a different concept of how things should work. And until that concept is proven not to function, they're going to keep doing it.
Yeah. Also, the other thing kind of noticed is I remember watching a lecture you were giving 2 years ago. You basically said that the Chinese government realized after 2008, the US model is not something they want to inherit. They want to follow that. They do not want China to become over consumption driven, and then you have all this debt problems happening in 2008, and they want to be like Germany, right? Export oriented.
Right. Yeah. Now there's some, there's some nuances on that because they have their own huge debt problems. They're just in the, the local government sector, et cetera. But yeah, that's basically right. They've decided that they want to be more of what I call a Leninist Germany, that is to say, a technology export-oriented economy with a huge manufacturing sector, but not social democratic, but Leninist. That's their model.
It's actually an interesting point to pivot to the next question because you mentioned about the Chinese government had this industrial policy, want to invest in manufacturing sector, high-tech sector to drive global competitive companies. However, you see U.S. and China has a trade war 2.0 happened last year, right? When Trump returned to the office, and now it seems like China's trade war, I would say trade conflict with the European Union and other countries are just getting more and more headlines. Right. So you see the news, right? And the Chinese overcapacity is definitely a problem. Some of the company like Xiaomi, you said it's super competitive. It's if you put it in North America, probably all the other electric vehicle company will be killed. But again, it's in China, and there's not only one Xiaomi, there's also BYD and other car EV manufacturers.
Yeah. Right.
So there definitely seems to be an overcapacity problem in China. And Professor Qin Hui used a concept, they call it Honecker's fable. So basically, he said like if a totalitarian regime like East Germany treat freely with all the Western civilized countries, and while suppressing its workers' condition, you're gonna have like unfair advantage over like democratic countries. And then eventually those countries will start to decoupling with you because they think they cannot outcompete you in a fair arena. So how do you kind of see that, like with that, the trade war and all the other like, tax policies, kind of protectionism in different countries starting to hurt the Chinese model?
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical of this story. Because, you've had protectionist pressure building for the last, 7 or 8 years, starting with the trade war that Trump launched in 2018. Now, in fairness, for the first few years, it really didn't add up to much. It's no more, significant. Nonetheless, all of this protectionist pressure, what has it done to China's exports? Nothing. Basically, they continue to grow. What has it done to China's share of global manufactured goods exports? Nothing. They still account for, over 20% of global manufacturers. They run the overall trade surplus, has grown to over $1 trillion. If you just look at the manufactured component of that, it's even larger. If the rest of the world is thinking that they're going to, solve their problem with China by being protectionist, they're doing a really bad job of it. So that's, I think, the first observation is that protectionist rhetoric and protectionist action has actually not had that much of an impact. And I think the other thing that you see is that these technological supply chains are very complicated, right? And what you continue to see, despite all the protectionism, is companies throughout the world realizing that they need to do things in China to be more competitive or have Chinese suppliers. So there's a lot of, among all of this sort of rhetorical decoupling pressure, what you see at the ground level is very, very limited decoupling in a few sectors. A great example of this is autonomous driving in the United States, right? So the industry leader there is Waymo. They have, a number of places that they source their vehicles from, but a big one is the Chinese company Geely, their Zeekr brand. And, they haven't really advertised this, and the kind of the way that they get around the tariffs, I believe, is that they essentially, the car is not a fully functioning unit until it is equipped with all of Waymo's self-driving equipment. So they basically take the guts of the car from Geely, and then they put all of the equipment on top of it. Still kind of expensive, and they're looking at other options. But there's a lot of continued back and forth between the U.S. and the Chinese tech ecosystems because they still kind of need each other.
Yeah.
So I basically think that first of all, China's competitive advantages are not just low labor cost, right? They now have the top companies there now legitimately have globally competitive or sometimes globally leading technology. This is clearly true in electric vehicles and batteries. I think it is increasingly true in things like industrial automation, robots, et cetera. It's clearly true in green energy equipment, and you can go on and on. And so China has very strong technology. They have an ecosystem that enables technology to be scaled up very quickly. So the unit costs come down essentially through economies of scale, where they can iterate much more quickly. So the product cycle for a Chinese electric vehicle, typically is 12 to 18 months compared to 3 to 5 years for a Western vehicle maker. And so if you can bring products to market much more quickly, you're going to be able to keep up with or anticipate consumer demand much better than your competitor. So this isn't true in every single Chinese sector, and I think we need to be careful about assuming that everything in China is like the EV industry, because it's not.
Yeah.
But in those leading industries, Chinese companies are just really, really good at what they do, and they have advantages which are very, very large and multifaceted, and really cannot be offset by a tariff, unless they could be offset by an export exclusion and just say we are going to ban the imports of your products, period, which is kind of what the US has done. Most countries aren't interested in doing that because they want the stuff. Most countries do not have competitive industries that they need to protect. So if China has the best product at the lowest price, they're going to buy that. And what you've seen is that China has been very successful at shifting away from the US market to other markets, particularly in the emerging world. They get lower prices, so it hurts them. But they get the volume and they get the market exposure. So I think that China is now so integrated in the global economy, and the sources of its competitiveness are so diverse, and so many of them are technologically determined. I don't think that decoupling works. It only works if you have basically a world war, which forces everyone to decouple, which has happened a couple of times before. That would be very bad on many levels. But short of that, it is very hard to see fully effective decoupling, other than here and there. Individual specific supply chains that are really, really important. Yeah, maybe, but on a macro scale, I don't really see China being derailed by that.
Got it. And also, I think it also depends on the other democratic countries' president and their policy. During Biden's era, he's promoting a friendshoring technology, friendshoring strategy, basically working with all the other kind of countries that have the similar government or democratic values compared to America, and then kind of allocate those supply chain there. But I think when President Trump came into office, he immediately abandoned Biden's strategy, and I think that to a certain extent actually helps China a little bit on that side, because he started a trade war with everybody. So the competitive advantage of doing the friendshoring is much less compared to the Biden era, because you have less tariff from other countries.
Yeah, and I think even that, I was much more sympathetic to the friendshoring strategy than to what Trump is doing, for sure. But it's pretty severely limited, right? And the point that I've made in some of my publications is that China just has a very special ecosystem, which is extremely powerful. And if you want to compete with them across the board, you would have to recreate that ecosystem across the board. It's basically impossible to do that under a friendshoring model, because every country has its own interests. You can't coordinate it. It's way more complicated. So the only way that friendshoring works is that you pick a few sectors where you think it's really, really important not to rely on Chinese inputs, or not to rely on them totally. And in these individual sectors, you say, okay, we're going to pick not everything, but 3 or 4 or 5, and do that really robustly. And that could work if you give it enough time. But I think the problem now is that, as you say, that Trump has basically abandoned that strategy. And if you look, for example, what are the incentives in Europe? They're very mixed right now, because on the one hand, a lot of their industrial base is getting hollowed out by Chinese competition. On the other hand, the US is shutting off its markets. So what do you do if you're European industry? A lot of European industries would say, particularly the car makers, would say, well, look, we can't really rely on the US anymore, so we need to double down on our investments in China so that we can stay close to the leading edge. We can take advantage of all of the ecosystem benefits there. And that's how we keep ahead, on innovation. And that may or may not work, but it's pretty understandable why they're thinking that way.
Yeah, definitely agree. Now let's move on to the next question. I think this is very interesting, because recently Beijing is finally doing some kind of fiscal packages to help the market. I would say in the Chinese term, they call it 救市. It's basically saving the market. And Professor Xu is very skeptical. He views those measures strictly through the lens of a soft budget constraint.
Yeah.
He argued that this money is not real stimulus for the girls, or is actually just an essential life support for all those local government debt, as you mentioned before. Like there's a lot of local government shadow banking kind of going on, and they have those investment platform which have a lot of low quality investment and a huge debt problem. Do you agree with that observation? Like all the stimulus is basically try to life support the system instead of really try to encourage more consumptions or help the every citizens in China.
Yeah, I basically agree with that. I think the soft budget constraint idea, this is an idea that goes back to a Hungarian scholar, János Kornai, who back in the, I think, 80s or 90s wrote a very good explanation of how he was talking about Eastern Bloc countries and how they worked under the sort of socialist model. It's a very powerful concept, and I think it explains a ton of what's going on in China. And it's basically, the idea is these local governments or state actors can spend a lot of money, and at the end of the day, if they make bad decisions, they don't have to bear the cost of those decisions. They don't go bankrupt or whatever. And I think that is continues to be a very powerful concept as relates to China. And I think it accurately describes the so-called stimulus program. So you can talk about either these debt swaps narrowly, or you can talk about the broader so-called stimulus measures that the government started putting in place about 1.5 years ago. And I never called them stimulus measures. I said these are support measures.
Yeah,
they're there to, make sure that economic activity doesn't fall below a certain level, but they're not aiming to accelerate things. But I think Professor Xu, puts his finger on a very important point here, which is that not only are they not stimulative, they kind of embed a big reason for why you have this problem of excess capacity in China. Right? So why do you have 20 or 30 electric vehicle companies producing at scale? I mean, there more.
It used to be 100.
Yeah, I'm discounting the ones that really exist more on paper, but ones that really produce significant numbers of EVs. There's 20 or 30 of them, right? There probably should be 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Right? How come in industry after industry, you have the situation where there are many, many more competitors than it seems like the market should be able to bear. And this lasts for a really long time. And the basic reason for this is local government support. So if you are a local government, you need to have local sources of tax revenue and employment. And so you will find everything in your power to keep your local EV maker or steel mill or whatever it is in business, so that you can collect the tax revenue and the people will be employed, right? And because local governments have a lot of tools at their disposal, not just cash, but they can hand out free land, they can lean on the local power plant to say, okay, cut this guy's electricity bill by 50% or whatever. They have a lot of non-budgetary mechanisms by which they can support industries and keep them in business, even if the company is intrinsically not very profitable. So instead of a normal process where you have a flood of new entrants into a hot sector, and then within a couple of years most of them go bankrupt and a few survive, the people who should have gone bankrupt stay in business for an incredibly long period of time, right? And so that's kind of the ultimate, soft budget constraint, if you will. What's interesting now is that the central government has said, oh, well, this is terrible. We don't like all this excess competition. It must not exist. We must have fewer companies. Local governments, you must stop subsidizing these companies.
Yeah.
But does the central government ever attack the central issue here, which is the way that the fiscal system has set up?
Yeah.
Which, number one, gives local governments immense authority to channel resources to these companies. And then number two, gives them immense incentives to do that, because if they don't do that, then they literally will have no budget revenues. Right?
Yeah.
And the central government is responsible for that because they've set up a fiscal system which makes it very, very hard for local governments to generate any revenue except by essentially taxes on production.
Yeah.
but the central government is not going to tamper with that. So yeah, this whole soft budget constraint is a problem for economic growth. It is essentially what creates the excess capacity problem.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, I think the central government's view on this is, well, this is not ideal. We would love it if there were only BYD and Xiaomi and two other companies making EVs and being very profitable. On the other hand, how much effort are we going to put into remaking the system so that happens? Not that much, because okay, these guys have to cut their prices to the bone. That's great, because then they are more competitive on global export markets, and prices fall for domestic consumers. So the central government, I think, is very much complicit in this setup, and so far they do not have they appear not to have a strong interest in changing the system. What they can do is like shovel more money into the system through things like these debt swaps in order to make sure that the local government stays solvent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like because of those local government policy, you have so many competitors. You have this like fierce competition. Kind of everybody has to lower their price. If there's a new market kind of come out, like the EV market 10 years ago, everybody is jumping in. Like every city have their own EV manufacturer.
Yes.
That definitely create a lot of competition for developing the advanced technology, because you cannot survive in that kind of environment without any advanced technology. But I think that also a huge waste of the taxpayers' dollars.
For sure.
Those money could be spent on other more productive activity, like investing in the education or try to help improve the those farmers' working environment, try to improve those people's life. Don't you think that part of the reason for the low consumption is also driven by this, like the policy kind of heavily tilts towards local investment and stuff,
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely the case. I mean, this gets back to the point that I made earlier about how basically the state commandeers all of the financial income of the country and directs it to these investments, rather than allowing it to recirculate through the economy the way it would in a more market-oriented system. So that is, I think, absolutely at the heart of the question of the investment consumption balance and also the growth rate. So the thing that I've been sort of trying to figure out for the last few years is it's become very clear that under Xi Jinping, the Chinese government is much less concerned about maintaining a high economic growth rate than previous leaders, right? And when they talk about development, it used to be that development meant a high GDP growth rate.
Yeah.
Right? Under Xi Jinping, it means technology development. And the growth rate has to be, a certain level, but it doesn't have to be that high, right? So we seem to be, and this is essentially what they have achieved, is an economy that is making really impressive technological progress in many fields, but is growing a lot slower. And if you read government documents on this, what they will tend to say is, well, don't worry, all this new technology will produce enormous new productivity gains, and this will, cause higher growth in the future. That's what they say. And the problem with that is that most people in China do not work in the technology industries, right? So what's the combined employment of EVs, semiconductors, industrial robotics, green energy, all of these things put together, that might be 10% of the national workforce. So in order for this to spill over into, the rest of the economy where everyone else works, you need to have some mechanism by which, the fact that you're really good at making electric cars creates some productivity benefit elsewhere in the economy. And that's where I start scratching my head, because I don't really see the ability for technological improvement to feed through into sort of generally higher productivity and higher wages for most people, right?
Yeah.
And you did actually have a mechanism for that essentially in the internet sector, right?
Yeah.
So for 10 or 15 years, you had these great companies like Alibaba and Tencent and so forth that were technological innovators and also gigantic employers. and they were essentially selling consumer services.
Yeah.
Um, and so there you could see a lot of spillovers between the technology that they were developing and and broader gains in income. And that is much less the case now. So China is now kind of, I think, a bifurcated place where the technology economy is overperforming, doing very, very well. And the total economy, the macro economy, is underperforming. And I don't really see a reason for that to change in the next several years. I don't think China's suddenly going to get a much faster growth rate. I don't think consumption is going to accelerate. But nor do I think that the technology progress is going to slow down. It's just this kind of weird combination of extreme technological competence, a lot of success in individual sectors, and an overall economy that always feels a little bit sluggish.
Yeah. So that actually brings up to the next question, which is very interesting because Professor Xu predicts that China is going to face a long-term stagnation because the Communist Party will not give up control. And Professor Qin kind of argued that like there's no accountability for welfare, and the Chinese people did not demand the government deliver like socialist promise that will kind of lead to this long stagnation for the country. Do you think that prediction holds any water? Like, do you think that argument is sound?
Yeah, I think both of those critiques are, we need to take them quite seriously because I think they put their finger on, some pretty real problems, right? So yeah, there's no question that, looking at Professor Xu's stagnation thesis, the increase in state control and the efficiency cost of just like channeling huge amounts of money into these investments that on average are very low productivity. All of that, creates, I think, a greater risk of stagnation. And you could argue that there were sort of there already. So China, people talk about real growth rates. So this is growth rates accounting for, inflation. So normally if you have like an economy is growing by 3 and inflation is 2, that means that your real growth rate is only 1 because you have to subtract the inflation rate from the nominal growth rate. Right? In China has the opposite now. The nominal economy is growing by like 3.5 or 4%. The prices are falling by 1%.
Yeah.
So they claim we have real growth of 5%, but that 5%, 1 percentage point of it is just coming from falling prices.
Yeah.
Not from increased activity. So in nominal terms, China has been growing slower than the United States for the last 4 years, which is kind of staggering when you consider that they were growing, way faster than the United States for many years. China's economy relative to the US peaked in 2020, I think, at about 75%. It's now down to about 65%. So China's economy in total compared to the US is smaller than it was 5 years ago. So you could argue, if you wanted to, that China is already, in a sense, stagnating. Now, that would be an exaggeration because it's still growing, pretty fast by any standard. So that's not stagnation. In my book would be it's not growing at all, and it's clearly growing, right? But there's, the dynamic that exists now is one where growth is a lot lower than it should be or could be. And the longer that goes on, I think the more risk that creates, problems.
Yeah.
So I as I said, I'm much more bullish than Xu Changgang, on China vis-a-vis Japan or the Soviet Union or any of these other comparisons. I think they have a lot going for them. Track record is very good. But the risk of an economy that over a long period of time, and here I would say you need to be talking about 10, 20 years, all of this inefficiency starts to catch up with it. Yeah, that risk is there, right? But again, this is not something that's going to happen in like 1, 2, 3, 5 years. This is going to be a much longer term dynamic. And then the other case was
Professor Qin, yeah, he argued that like if China want to get out of this current situation, they have to increase the welfare share, right?
Yeah,
Like,
right. So I think that's an interesting argument, and the counter to that is that, and I have one of my clients in the financial industry who recently put it to me this way. He said, "Look, you look at the United States, and this is an economy that is optimized for the top 20% of the income distribution. Yeah. So if you're in the top 20%, America is great. Yeah. You can do whatever you want, make lots of money. You're very secure. You can, invest, make big returns. Excellent, right? If you're lower down in the income scale, it's not so great, right? But for the top 20%, it's fantastic, right? China, his point was, is the opposite, right? For the 20th or the 30th percentile of income, life is fine, right?
Yeah.
You have a house. Most things don't cost very much.
Yeah.
If you live in the cities, social welfare provision is not fantastic, but it's not horrible. There are, the healthcare system is much better than it was. Decent education for your kids. Your retirement is basically taken care of. They're universal pensions. They're not fantastic, but they're there. You don't really have to worry about much. And I think that's a very good point, right? That the system that has been created, in terms of a formal social welfare system, it's not like the United States or Europe by any means. But in terms of creating a sense of security and sort of provision for a large majority of its people, it works pretty well. So I'm not sure that Qin is quite right in saying that the overall social welfare system in China is as bad as he would like to argue. I do think, though, that if you optimize in that way, you are creating some perverse incentives, right? And basically, what you're telling the majority of your population right now is, okay, you've got an okay life, and there isn't going to be that much growth, but we order you to be fine with it.
Yeah.
And, I think for a lot of people, it's like, okay, I'll take that deal, because the reality is my life is okay. And okay, I can't expect the same sort of growth that I would have a year or two ago, but that's fine. I can live with that deal. But if you make most of your population live with the deal where they just lose that aspiration for making things better, I think that gets you back into this stagnation question. I mean, what is the incentive for people to work really hard and try to improve things if they're not going to get anything out of it? And so I think there is a risk there that the way that they have chosen to organize the system creates more incentives for more people over time to just kind of check out from the system.
They call it lay flat, like
right. It's right. It's exactly. It's the Tongping, phenomenon. Exactly. Which I think is in terms of the current meme, I think it's a little bit overstated, because there's plenty of people who are not lying flat. But I think the incentive structure is in the Chinese economy is now a little bit questionable. Yeah. And the incentive structure for entrepreneurship is clearly much weaker than it was, say, 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah, I would definitely agree with that, because I know a lot of venture capitalists in China, they shouldn't be called venture capitalists. They're actually venture debt, because you have to sign an agreement. If your company fails, you have to buy back all the shares. Basically, you're put on huge loans, right?
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole separate conversation about the VC system in China, which is like a complete mess. But so I think there are definitely risks there. I would just say my basic response to both Qin and Xu Changgang on this would be that the risks are real, and I think they are kind of at the margin rising, but they are very, very slow to, I think, really have a material impact on China's momentum.
Yeah, there's another professor his name is Di Dongshen. So he recently did a podcast. He's arguing that the Chinese government should actually give out UBI, like basically give all
right,
the
yes,
young
right,
people like money to spend, because I think like the system
right.
is really not fair to them. Like that's like a compensation, and also encourage them to have babies and all the stuff. Do you think that Chinese
Yeah.
government can do that and will do that? I mean,
Well, they could if they wanted to, because they
yeah,
control the financial system.
yeah, yeah.
I don't think that they will, and personally, I don't think that they should. Right.
Hmm.
So, to me, the way that these problems get addressed is basically more flexibility in the financial system
Mm.
that hardens the budget constraints, right?
Hmm.
So you have a financial system that really punishes the companies that can't, survive and they go out of
Hmm.
business, and conversely rewards the companies that do really well, right?
Hmm.
And rewards the investors who put that capital at risk, right? So this is the whole point about the way that the state commandeers all financial income and moves it where it wants. Where China was actually moving up until about 2017 was to decentralize the financial system and create a more sort of consumer-oriented financial and capital allocation system.
Hmm.
And that clearly had significant risks attached to it. But from a standpoint of improving household welfare and making, people economically better off, I think that was the way to go. The point there is that that's a dynamic sort of market-driven system, not the
Hmm.
government saying, okay, we, the government, will decide that you will now have a basic income of X, right?
Yeah,
I don't think that really changes anyone's incentives at all.
yeah.
It's basically, that would just be a sort of a continuation of the existing sort of command-oriented system. So even if they did it, I don't think it would have that much impact, because I don't think it would really change people's incentives that much.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't think they're going to do it.
Okay. I think both Xu and Qing are very pessimistic, and also they have a deterministic view about China's future, right? Like they think China is
Right.
like the train on a track that kind of heading toward that
Right.
destiny, no
Right.
matter what you do, right?
Right.
But I think you are more
Right.
bullish on that. You think like Chinese economy is more resilience compared to
Right.
what they perceived.
Right.
Can you give us
Yeah.
a like maybe just like a forecast or your
Yeah.
view on like maybe in the next 2 to 3 years, like how the China economy would behave, or even
Sure.
the I would say like there people often like want to ask like how would the China stock market perform, right? Like
Okay.
that kind of perspective.
So the first thing I would say is I really hate being described as a China bull,
Hmm. Yeah.
because I don't, partly that's just aesthetic. Partly it's because I don't view my role as being, to take sides in
Yeah,
are
yeah,
you
yeah,
for it or are you against it, right? Which is, I've always described myself as a skeptical optimist,
yeah.
meaning, so the optimism is that I have very high conviction in the kind of underlying strengths and resilience and adaptability of the Chinese system.
Hmm.
Um, so, and this, I should also be clear that because I'm optimistic at core on the economy, this does not mean that I give approval to the political system. Those are two completely
Yeah,
different
yeah, yeah,
questions, right?
yeah.
Which often get mixed up. And I think it's perfectly possible to say, on one hand, these guys really know how to run an economy, and are very successful at mobilizing and deploying resources to achieve, impressive economic ends. That is one question. And what would be my value judgment on the right political system? That's a completely different question.
I know.
So,
Understood.
I want to be careful about those two stipulations. And so the skeptical part is that, there are always huge problems in China. And as
Hmm.
we've discussed, even though I disagree with some of the conclusions of the scholars that you've cited, a lot of analysis is spot on, right? There are
Hmm.
really, really difficult structural abiding problems,
Hmm.
which reduce efficiency, create bad incentives, both at the government level and at the company level. And if these are allowed to fester, yeah, over time, they could cause the economy to perform much, much worse than it has in the past, right? And when you put on top of that things like there's a big demographic problem, China benefited enormously from having a young population. It's now aging very quickly.
Yeah.
The average age in China will in about 15 years will be higher than in Japan.
Yeah.
Which is staggering. So whenever you see problems of that magnitude, you can say, okay, in the past, they've done a great job of dealing with their problems, but can they keep it up? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? And what are they doing to address the institutional constraints that they're putting on themselves, right? But if I had to, and as I've said before, my basic view right now is that China has a great tech economy and a kind of a mediocre macro economy. And so I don't really do forecasts, but my expectation would be, China's been growing by, in real terms, around 4 to 5%, in nominal terms, around 3 to 4%. I think that basically continues for the next few years, which is an okay result, but not terrific.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if you look at the technology ecosystem, it is very impressive, and I think is going to, expand into new sectors. And Chinese companies are going to become much more globally important. So I'm quite bullish, if you will, on China's the ability of the top Chinese companies to, attain leading positions in an increasing number of technology-intensive industries, right? I think that's very, very clear. And the sort of counter forces to that, whether it's protectionism or friend-shoring or industrial policy elsewhere, it's going to be a very, very long time before those kinds of countermeasures have impact. So China's got, I think, very strong capacities there. So the question I have in my mind is like, okay, you've got this great tech ecosystem, but it's an ecosystem that kind of exists in a bubble. And most of the rest of the Chinese economy where people live doesn't benefit that much from this fantastic tech ecosystem. So to me, the big question is, how can you get these two things more integrated? And how can you have wider benefits through the economy as a whole from this great tech progress that they're making? And I don't really, frankly, see that the government has a great answer to that. Right? They basically seem satisfied with the current situation, and they have the ability to keep things on track. And I don't think that the rest of the world has really any ability to throw it off track. China is very self-sufficient. So I'm not sure if that's a bull case, but that would be the case for not underestimating the adaptability of the Chinese corporate system. And I guess the final thing I would say is that even if you look at the political system, there have been some adaptations. And so I think one of Xi Jinping's characteristics as leader is that he is more rigid than his predecessors. Once he decides a thing is correct, he sticks with it. Yeah. For a very long time, even after the evidence piles up that he needs to change course. He's much more resistant to course correction than any of the previous three major leaders that we had. And that's a problem. If you have rigidity in the system, that means that inefficiencies build up rather than being dissipated. But he has made some course corrections. Yeah. And he has recognized that there needed to be more support. They're doing some things that are a little bit more household friendly. They're not gigantic, but so I think we can exaggerate how rigid the system is. It's still more rigid than it used to be. But again, what's your anchor here? Is your anchor, what is China today versus the China of 10 or 15 years ago? Or what is China today versus any other country that's out there? Yeah. Right. If you take the first comparison, it's like, there are a lot of things that today that are not as good in China as they were 10 years ago, arguably. There's some that are better, but there's some that are worse, right? But if you look at China compared to most other countries in the world, it still stacks up pretty well.
Yeah.
And their ability to adjust and to push resources where they're needed is still remarkable. And as long as that systemic adjustment capacity remains strong, then it's hard to see China sliding into the kind of extreme stagnation or sclerosis that some of the critics would say in the short run.
Yeah.
Short run meaning the next 5 years.
Yeah. That's the reason the book here, I have a quote here. It's not like a fully solid book. I think I don't know if you read the article. I remember 2 years ago, maybe that's the bottom of the Chinese equity. Basically, I think one analyst come out of, I can't remember, is that JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs? He basically says, the headline is that Chinese equity is not investable. And I think that marked the low of the market, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And I'm not like a markets guy or market strategist. But, I mean, one of the things that you see in markets is that people sort of take these very extreme positions.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And it's just like the last 2 years, that has not been the case. The Chinese stock market has done very well. And, people have recognized that it's not Japan, it's not the Soviet Union. And you have to take it in a somewhat more nuanced way.
I agree.
So I think that's healthy.
Yeah, I actually read an article early last year. I think end of the year before last year is basically saying Moody's came out and argued that all the Chinese credit situation and all the small business, particular manufacturing sectors, the worst part is behind us. Even though the recovery is super slow and uncertain, but it's no longer that in the shithole. Basically that kind of correlate with the market reaction. In the equity market.
Right. I think there's a sort of, I would broadly agree with that assessment. It's always a little bit perilous to say, we've hit the bottom. It's only up from here. But the other interesting thing is if you look at just credit flows into manufacturing, these expanded by a factor of 6 between 2019 and 2023. So there was a 6-fold increase in bank loans to manufacturing, which was the counterpart of the fact that the banks were no longer lending to property. So they stopped lending to property and they poured all of their lending into manufacturing. And so, people sometimes ask, okay, why do you have so much excess capacity in China? And partly the answer is, duh. There was a 6-fold increase in lending to manufacturing. So money was free for anyone who wanted to set up a manufacturing plant. So of course you got excess capacity, right? Now, what's interesting though is that peaked in 2023, and it fell in half in 2024, and it's roughly at that level today. So there are tightening financial conditions in China that I think actually are going to have started to show an impact in winnowing out some of this excessive competition. And it takes a long time because the local governments also play a role. But if the banks are no longer willing to pour money into these sectors, eventually people will start to fall by the wayside with some consolidation. But it'll be slow.
Yeah. So I also have some, I actually did a advertisement of this podcast happening. So some of my viewers raised some questions, and I'm going to go over some of those questions. One of the questions is, I think from the context, I can tell he probably is a young professional in China, kind of working in that tough job market.
Yeah.
So he's just saying that, currently young people are just laying flat, right? Just doing nothing, and have a very low desire. So you don't have a lot of consumption, probably never get married or have kids, and, just stay a very low profile life. That actually comes into a very dramatic contrast compared to on the news. You see China's neck to neck competition on the high tech area, right? So his question is, are we really looking at a permanent disconnect where the state become super high tech, the superpower, but the average citizen is just left behind with no way up?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think on all of these things, China is a big country and there are a lot of different things going on, right? So depending which piece you choose to look at, you can come away with totally, different things. So if you spend your time like in Shenzhen, going around to all these companies and seeing all the people and how hard they're working, say, no one's lying flat here, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But then you go elsewhere, and yes, this is clearly an issue. I don't have a terrific answer to that other than to kind of repeat what I said earlier, which is that there's this disconnect between the vibrant tech economy and large swaths of the rest of the economy. And there isn't a lot of benefit in most of the country, in most of the job market, particularly from these great tech industries. So, for example, the net number of jobs that has been created in Chinese manufacturing in the last 10 years is negative.
Yeah.
So even as China's taken over the world in all of these sectors, there are fewer people working in manufacturing today than there were 10 years ago. Right? All new job creation is in the service sector. And, a lot of those jobs are very uninspiring, and, you don't see a lot of progress. So no, I think that's a problem. And I think from a social standpoint, I think it's really tough in China. And I think particularly if you are under 30 in China, it is really tough. It is probably the toughest it has ever been in all the years that I've been there. Because even like in the 90s, when people forget, it was pretty tough. There were people working for state-owned enterprises. They laid off tens of millions of them. It was the new economy hadn't really fully taken off. They had to create 20 million new jobs a year just to keep everyone employed. It was hard to be a young person back in the 90s, but then at least you had a sense that things were going someplace,
getting better.
If you put in some effort, it would pay off. And now I think it's true that for an increasing number of people, they don't get the sense that there's a payoff to effort. So why bother, right? So I think I don't have a great answer to that. I think if you look at the totality of China, I think there are more people not lying flat than are lying flat. But again, this is, I think, one of the risks that's out there.
I agree. I was actually in Shenzhen last October, and the company I visited, they are having a meeting at about 12 o'clock at night. I was like, you guys are crazy. I'm going back to the hotel. And they were saying, the owner said, like, I'm going to send you with my driver, but I'm going to stay here and have a board meeting with my partner. I was like, okay, great. Like, he thinks is doing really well. So he's apparently not laying flat.
Yeah.
And the next question, I think it's very interesting because I know you observe Chinese economy through your lens as a journalist and also as a consultant, right? Like you have your own firm kind of doing the analysis. However, there's a lot of criticize about like the Chinese government data. They say, like your GDP growth doesn't align with the investment figures. Your export data is contradicting all the trading partners importing data. You're just like making the data up. Do you think that that's like a reasonable critic? And they compare that to Soviet Union because Soviet Union apparently made up some numbers like through their government agencies. How do you navigate that kind of situation?
The short answer is no. I don't think this is a valid critique. And I think this is a great example of what we were talking about at the top, which is a political argument masquerading as an economic one. When people say we don't trust the data, what they're really saying is, well, we don't really like the Communist Party. We don't trust it. So therefore, anything that it says, including its statistics, we disbelieve, right? So I think the one way to think about this is China is a globally integrated economy, right? They're the biggest exporter in the world. I think they're still number 2 in imports behind the United States. They have huge investments globally. the trade data, actually, there's a technical thing in the balance of payments now, which is a focus of controversy. But in fact, the discrepancies in the trade data are pretty minor and basically pretty easy to explain. And so the reality is that the trade data is one of the ways that you can validate what's going on in China, right?
Yeah.
If the economy were really so small, how come they import so much oil? Right?
Yeah.
For example, right?
Yeah.
And there are things that you can measure physically, like output of electricity and so forth, which just, that is not fakeable, right?
Yeah.
So the Soviet Union basically had a made-up economy, which was largely autarkic, right? They didn't trade with the rest of the world. They were just within themselves.
Yeah.
And so in that kind of situation, you can make up all kinds of numbers.
Yeah.
And they can seem to be true for a while.
Yeah.
And then once you are exposed to the rest of the world, they're revealed as lies. Basically, that's essentially, and that would have been true, I think, of China in the 60s and 70s. I mean, when they really were a closed-off economy. It doesn't, if China were really making things up, my rule of thumb is, in an open system, and this would apply to a country making up its statistics. Most people running sort of a corporate Ponzi scheme like Enron, you can probably do that for about 5 years at scale. And you cannot do it longer for 5 years.
Yeah.
You can do it longer than 5 years if you're Bernie Madoff and you're just like one guy with, a handful of investors. But at scale, you can run a statistics scam of this type for a few years. So if it hasn't been revealed as, if it hasn't collapsed in 5 years, what that tells you is whatever the problems are, these numbers are broadly, telling you the truth.
Yeah.
And, and then you can get into all kinds of technical discussions about like the GDP numbers and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But here's another way of thinking about it. So for a long time, there's a cottage industry, people saying, well, China's economic growth rate for the last 30 years has not been 10%. It's really been 7%.
Yeah.
And here are all these adjustments that I do to prove that it's 7, not 10. But the reality is, because it's an open economy, you can say with high accuracy, how big is the economy today? And you can look at the oil import numbers and stuff like that and calibrate that. And so if for 30 years your economy is X, and then for the last 30 years your economy was growing not by 10 but by 7, what that means is that 30 years ago your economy was twice as big as you thought it was then. How likely is that? Or conversely, if we think that number was correct and they were really growing by 7, not 10, then the economy is only half as big as it appears to be today. And how likely is that? Right? There's like a very easy smell test that you can do on these kinds of exercises, which, exposes them. So no, I refuse to take that seriously. These are mostly people who are discontented with the political system, which I understand.
Yeah, I agree.
Or who extrapolate actual real data problems, which are significant and which require a lot of work to untangle, and say, oh, well, because we can't believe this thing, therefore we can't believe anything, therefore we can make up our own numbers about what we think the reality of it is. And I just don't find that at all a credible form of argumentation.
Yeah. I think that's a very good explanation. I agree with you on most points. The next question is actually, since President Xi came into power, he's definitely tightening the control on the whole society, right? You see more surveillance, you see more big data control, and like a lot of dollars, like a lot of money is budget spent on like really keep the society stable. They call it like the cost of wei wen, like it's in Chinese. How sustainable that would be, because that cost is kind of increasing as the economy is not doing well. People have opinions and they are discontent with the current political system, and you're going to spend more and more money on doing that. And
that is, I think there are a lot of interesting points that are raised by that question. So one answer is that over a long period of time, the party and the government in China have done a very good job of basically making sure that living standards rose for most people in most places. And they did a very good job of pushing resources from rich areas to poor areas so that no area got too far left behind. And there's still a lot of inequality and so forth in China. It's not by any means a perfect system, but they did okay. And I think basically sold people on the idea that if you stick with us, you will do okay. And we just ask you to like silence your political views.
Exactly.
But we guarantee that you'll be okay. And that largely worked. What's interesting, and if there's very good survey data from the, like 2010, 2012, showing that when there was a lot of discussion about social discontent in China, that actually people were not that discontented. People said, well, if people get rich, it's because they're smart and hardworking, and if you're poor, it's because you're lazy and dumb. The system is not rigged. And the survey data also very clearly showed that people have a lot of complaints about their local officials that they see, and they tend to have a much higher opinion of the central leadership. So, in other words, they're not, in general, people are not saying the system is rotten and corrupt. They're saying my local officials are rotten and corrupt. And that's the issue, not some kind of more systemic thing. Now, what's interesting is that some of the survey work has been redone recently, and it came to a more a darker conclusion, which is that after 10 years of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaigns, people are much more likely to say, if you're successful, it's because you were corrupt than they were 10 years ago.
Interesting.
So that is interesting. And you can only speculate as to why this is so. I two ideas come to mind. One is just like, the economy is growing a lot slower than it was, and people see less opportunity. And if people see less opportunity, then they're more willing to look for scapegoats. Right? So I think that's part of it. The other possible part of it is because Xi Jinping has spent so much time trumpeting corruption that people have been just internalized more of a sense about, oh, wow, I didn't realize that the system was that
so corrupt.
So it kind of, the anti-corruption in that sense sort of backfired. And if you look at what they spend on domestic security and so forth, it is massive. And so that is a cost. I don't think it's crippling yet for a couple of reasons. One is, again, for most people in most of urban China, life is pretty good and your material circumstances are reasonably well taken care of. And there's a sense of security and stability that is broadly shared. And that could change, but right now, I think that's most people's experience. So there's a degree of tolerance that people give to the system because things are kind of okay. Then the other thing is like I hate to blame things on sort of entertainment culture, but the reality is China has a very rich entertainment culture that is very low cost, right? And people talk about, there's the Great Firewall and you can't get foreign websites, and no one in China cares about that. They have a tremendous domestic internet that they can, play on all day. There's huge, sort of gaming, short video, whole ecosystem, social media, very vibrant. So people can live pretty active lives in that sense. Where they're not super constrained unless they get into, very targeted political rhetoric.
I agree.
So I tend to think that all of these things mean that, look, this is not the system that I would choose to live under. And I think it's too constraining and whatnot. But I think it is a system that continues to work well enough at acceptable cost for the regime. And you can critique it in any number of ways, but I don't think that it's likely to fall apart or create some kind of unbearable cost in the next several years.
The next question is very interesting. I think basically the listener is arguing, like trying to push back against all the pessimism from Professor Xu or Qinghui. He basically said that China has such a low cost of living. We have like really cheap utilities, great transportation, really low cost. Education is really cheap. Like I did my high school, like college education in China, and the cost is not that great. It's not a heavy burden for my parents, like to kind of support me through that. U.S. is completely different story. I think in all the Western developed countries, those private schools are super expensive. But like they argue that that's kind of the hidden welfare the Chinese people are enjoying, comparing to those wealthy nations like U.S., which is not direct cash handout, but it's like it's benefit you kind of get. So that's the reason that a lot of people in China are still happy with where they are, even though not as happy as they could be, but like they're still comfortable living there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I kind of made that point earlier when I was talking about the social welfare system. That in formal terms, if you measure what do they pay out in pensions and social insurance and so forth, it's not that great. But if you look at the kind of what you call the implicit social welfare system, there are a lot of elements into it, and this sort of low cost of living is one. And I think if you look at Xi Jinping's rhetoric over the last several years, when people talk about deflation and so forth, I think it's pretty clear that this is how he views
it. Yeah.
That what's wrong with deflation? It means lower prices, everyone is better off, and so forth. So I think there is some, and it is true that you look at the United States, what's the big political issue at the moment? It's affordability.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because housing costs too much, and there are all these other costs that are too much, and it's a real problem.
Yeah.
And I think the sort of the flip side of that is, yes, that China has. One of the ways that they are able to engineer this sort of tolerance among the citizenry is that you can live an okay life for not that much money. And so that kind of reduces your expectations of how much money you need to make now or how much you need to make in future in order to be okay. So I think that is part of the, if you will, the consent mechanism they create.
Yeah. So next question he asked about is kind of from the global South strategy. So he said like, oh yeah, China company has this overcapacity. Instead of fighting with all the hostile Western markets, can we just simply pivot to invest in the global South, like working with Africa, working with like other Asian countries, and to create new demand?
Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, I think the reality is that the U.S. and Europe, the rich countries, are still the best markets.
Exactly.
If you talk to any of these big Chinese tech companies like BYD or CATL, they are desperate to get into the U.S. market. They would love that so much because they're huge markets. You can charge higher prices. So yeah, you can get by, diversifying into lower income markets, but that is clearly a suboptimal strategy.
I agree.
For most of these companies. So, a more ideal situation from Chinese corporate perspective is if they could work out some arrangement whereby, they could gain more access. And let's be real about this. I mean, if you divide the world into the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries, this is about 30 rich democracies, basically. They still account for 60+% of the global economy. And that's down from what it was 30 years ago, but that's still 2/3 of the global economy. And that share is falling, but it's falling very slowly.
Yeah.
So I think it is much more rational for China to have a sort of all of the world strategy on this. And it's a little bit wishful thinking to think that if you're completely shut out of the markets of the US and Europe, that you can totally make this up and global South. Now, the reality is that you're not totally shut out of the US and European markets, particularly in Europe.
Yeah.
But even in the US, the Chinese companies can't sell cars, but consumer electronics, they're selling a ton.
Oh, yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So the reality is that China continues both directly and indirectly to be heavily, heavily reliant on the US and the other developed markets. And that's going to be the case for some time to come.
Yeah. So the next question from the listener is he's asking about like a philosophical question about the strong nation, right? So I think we can all agree like China as a state power is like number two, or like I mean
Yeah.
like President Trump is talking about G2, right? I think he's a very pragmatic and realist in the geopolitics area.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't argue against that, but like from the individual average citizen living standard, China is still pretty much behind of all the
Yeah.
leading Western countries, right? So his question is like, does U.S. and China simply have fundamentally different definition of what constitutes a strong nation? Like U.S. is really focused on the individual, but China is like we are just looking at the grand country. We're strong. That's
Yeah.
it. We don't really
Yeah.
need to push for that individual
Yeah.
improvement.
Um, yeah, I think that's to some degree a fair point. It's
Mhm.
maybe less true than it was a year ago. I mean, with
Mhm.
Trump now, it seems pretty clear. I mean, the position of the U.S. government is that we really don't care that much about individual welfare, and what we care
Yeah.
about is these kind of tokens of state power.
Yeah, I think like there's a funny joke. Everybody expect China to behave more like U.S., but now U.S. is behaving more like
Yeah,
China.
yes, that's right. They're kind of a bad copy of China. They're
Yeah.
taking all the worst aspects and none of the good stuff.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, and I think what that reveals is that okay, so the U.S. has always had sort of this ideology of individualism and so
Hmm.
forth, and the economy has been run at least since World War II
Hmm.
uh, with a pretty strong bias in favor of sort of consumer welfare.
Hmm.
Um, but the U.S. has also been a big global power for a long time.
Yeah.
Pretty imperialist. Um, and the imperialism takes different guises. Right now, it's basically naked.
Yeah.
Um, but even when it wasn't naked, it was still there, right? So I think the U.S. leadership has for a very long time taken quite seriously, concepts of what you need to do to promote what the Chinese would call comprehensive national power.
Hmm.
Um, and I think I guess if I had to analyze, I would say, look, if you look in the Cold War, there was a clear sort of U.S. versus Soviet Union
Hmm.
rivalry. Um, there were a lot of national projects in the United States in the 50s and 60s,
Yeah.
particularly, which were driven by this sense of great power competition. And there were things that we had to do as a nation
Hmm.
that didn't have anything to do with consumer welfare, but were important for national,
Yeah.
power, right?
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the Cold War, basically from the 90s onwards, the US said, well, we don't really have to do that anymore because we're the sole remaining superpower. And so we don't need these national projects. We can just, do individualized wealth maximization,
Hmm.
basically. And that's fine. And then you add all that up and we're great. Um, and in some sense, they were. I mean, if you look at the US economic performance since the financial crisis of 2008, it is the best of any country in the world,
Yeah.
basically, better than any developed country. And for the last 5 years, as I said, it's actually been growing faster in nominal terms than China. So
Yeah.
there is a way in which that works. Um, um, but it's also, would you say that the U.S. has been run totally with an idea to making the individual's life as good as it possibly can be? Well, a lot of people in the U.S. would dispute that.
Yeah. I
There are
agree.
all these questions about affordability. There's huge social fractures that are showing up in the political
I know.
system. There are a lot of
Yeah.
people in the country who feel that they've gotten a raw deal. Um, so it's mixed, right? It's mixed in the U.S. And I think the difference is that China has a kind of a more unified political system. It is authoritarian, so there is kind of an authoritative view that comes out at the top.
Hmm.
It is, basically a Leninist political structure, so highly centralized.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yes, there is this kind of vision of national power. Um, that gets articulated, which is divorced from most concepts of like consumer welfare.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say it's also balanced, right? So I think the reason that China has been so successful for so long is like they've been pursuing national power in this overall way, but they've recognized that in order for that to be sustainable, most people in China have to get enough out of it
Mm-hmm.
for them to keep playing the game. So there has been this sense that there has to be broad, shared prosperity and growth in China that goes down to the household level.
Mm-hmm.
So the kind of Leninist comprehensive national power aspiration has always been, I think, tempered over the last few decades by this knowledge that if we do it the way the Soviet Union did, we will end up the way the Soviet Union did.
Mm-hmm.
And what the Soviet Union did is that it did not pay enough attention to the quality of life for the average citizen, and to sort of economic opportunity. And I think that lesson is still very, very deeply entrenched in the Chinese leadership, however much they've become more focused on these great power competition issues.
Yeah. Do you think China can transition into a model that Singapore has done? You know, like Singapore is not really, from our American terms, it's not really a democratic country, right? Like it has a very strong party kind of ruling, and it has a decent social welfare program, and also pretty cracking down on people who have dissent or criticize the government. But even though like the government has a pretty good reputation of improving the welfare, but they have a very good judicial system. I think they call it 法治, right? Like they basically rule by law, right? I would argue I think rule by law is more important than democracy. Just like voting, everybody has one vote. Like typically you will have majority tyranny, or like there's other terms talking about that. Like I don't think that's the ideal system. You will have more populist government coming out of that. I think do you think China has the potential to kind of transition to the Singapore model, be more judicious, like rule by law, focus on that instead of getting you into a populist democracy?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of responses to that. So first of all, as a American, I will disagree with you on that last point. I think democracy is a very good thing. It doesn't guarantee good governance, but it gives you, I think, a better shot at sustaining good governance over a long period of time.
I agree.
Than most other systems. And the other thing is that I think people get a little bit too hung up on the sort of rule by law or rule of law thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question in my mind that the U.S. as it stands today is a little bit over lawyered, so we can do with a little less of that. But also, what it really boils down to is can you sustain good governance, right? And having a good legal system with various kinds of checks on power, I think it's really important to do that, and it's very difficult to achieve that in any kind of non-democratic system. So I would still, personally, I would just say, over the long run, in an advanced economy, you're better off with democracy than with some other system. I mean, what happens when Xi Jinping dies, right? Mm-hmm. We have no idea what is going to happen to the Chinese political system after that. And you can imagine many, many different outcomes, right? Mm-hmm. So clearly, democracy a la the U.S. has a lot of problems, and we are seeing them full on right now. So I don't want to sugarcoat it. But just it's like on average over time, which would you rather have? I think that's that. I would still go for that. And in terms of, but that said, I think authoritarian systems also have a wide range. Some are very effective, do provide good governance over a long period of time. China is a good example of that. Mm-hmm. And I think Singapore, you're right, is sort of the ultimate example of a non-democratic authoritarian system that has provided very consistent, constrained good governance for a very, very long time. So they have a successful model. I will end with a apocryphal anecdote that gives you my view on whether China could become like Singapore. So I don't know remember who told me the story, and I'm sure it's not true, but it's too good not to use. So the story is that Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore back in the 80s, came up to Beijing and had a meeting with Deng Xiaoping. And Lee Kuan Yew, as was his wont, talked endlessly about how great he was and how Singapore was and how China should do this and China should do that. And Deng just sort of sat there very quietly, every so often would spit into his spittoon. And then finally, after Lee Kuan Yew had sat down and exhausted himself, Deng leaned forward and said, "Mr. Lee, that was very interesting. And should I ever become the mayor of a city, I will be sure to follow your advice." So the point of it being, what you can do in Singapore, because it is a city-state, has basically nothing to do with what is achievable on a full-scale country, let alone a full-scale country on the scale of China, which is just gigantic, both in terms of population, geography, social complexity, etc. So no, that I think a clean Singapore option is not available for China. It is always going to be a way more complicated and fractious, governance challenge. And if you look at the reality of China today, I think that's still true. It's still, Xi Jinping has a lot more authority than past leaders. It's very centralized, but there's still a lot going on at the local level that the center is not really able to control all that well.
Yeah.
So whatever China's political evolution is going to be, it's going to be its own thing. It's not going to be, I think, all that close either to the Singapore model on the one hand or the U.S. model on the other hand. How to figure some other path.
Yeah, I think I really like your story. And I remember reading an article. Basically, the scholar argued that democracy is a luxury. Like when you average GDP reach a certain level, above that level, it's more likely you're going to keep that democracy. Otherwise, you're going to see that democracy kind of turned into, authoritarian regime, and it's very easy for people to hijack the system and change a bunch of the rules and change the constitution. And now you're seeing that happens in a lot of democratic country, or formerly viewed as democratic country, right? For example, Venezuela is one example. Like it used to have a very, broad, participated democratic system, but when Chavez win the election and he just changed the constitution, and he basically slowly but surely destroyed the system. I really appreciate your time, and today's conversation is really good. I really appreciate your time and participation, and hope you doing well in your future endeavors.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I thought it was a great conversation, very well structured. I enjoyed all the questions, and I enjoyed being able to engage even vicariously with Qinhui and Xu Shangang. There's a lot of very interesting food for thought there.
Yeah, really, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, right. Bye-bye.